My name is Gerald Whitfield. If you just found this channel, I need you to take a slow breath before I start. Because what I'm about to share with you is something I spent the better part of 3 years trying to make sense of. I'm 64 years old. I've worked with my hands my whole life. Spent 31 years as a long-haul freight driver running routes between Edmonton and Vancouver, and I thought I understood what it meant to protect the people I loved. I thought providing for them, keeping the roof over their heads and food on the table, was the same as keeping them safe. I was wrong. And the worst part is, the danger wasn't out on the highway. It wasn't a stranger at the door. It was right there inside my own home, and it was wearing the face of someone I trusted completely. My grandson Tyler was 8 years old when it started. Or at least 8 years old when I first noticed something was off. He'd been living with me for about 18 months at that point. His mother, my daughter, had been in and out of treatment for addiction up in Fort McMurray. And we'd made the decision as a family that Tyler would stay with me in the Juche while she got herself sorted out. My wife, Margaret, had passed 3 years before that, cancer, so it was just me and Tyler in the house. I converted the spare room into his bedroom, put up some hockey posters, bought him one of those little foam nets for the hallway. He was a bright kid. Curious, the kind of boy who asks questions about everything. Why the sky turns that particular shade of orange in a prairie winter. Why geese always fly in a V. Why I kept a photo of a truck I no longer owned on my desk. He made the house feel alive again in a way I hadn't realized I needed. My sister-in-law Brenda, Margaret's younger sister, had moved to Leduc about 6 years before this all happened. After Margaret passed, Brenda had become a kind of anchor for me. She helped me navigate the grief, the paperwork, the sudden loneliness of a house that used to hold 4 people and now held 1. When Tyler came to live with me, Brenda stepped in without being asked. She'd come over after school 3 days a week while I was on routes, make him dinner, help with homework. Tyler called her Auntie Bren. She'd baked him a birthday cake in October, shaped like a Zamboni. I thought it was one of the most generous things anyone had ever done for us. I want you to hold that image for a moment. The Zamboni cake. Because it matters later. The first sign was so small I nearly missed it. I came home in late February from a 5-day Edmonton to Prince George run, and Tyler didn't come to the door to meet me. He always met me at the door. I'd been doing this long enough that he knew the sound of my truck pulling into the driveway, and he'd be standing there in his socks on the front step, no matter the cold. That night, I walked in and found him sitting at the kitchen table, doing a puzzle by himself. Quietly. Too quietly. He looked up at me and smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I figured he was tired. Kids get tired. By March, I couldn't keep telling myself it was tiredness. His teacher, Mrs. Okafor, called me one Thursday afternoon. She said Tyler had fallen asleep at his desk twice in the past 2 weeks. She said he seemed distracted, sometimes startled at loud sounds, and that he'd stopped joining in at recess with the other boys. She asked me gently if anything had changed at home. I told her his home situation had been complicated, that he was adjusting, and I promised to keep a closer eye on him. When I sat down with Tyler that evening and asked him how he was doing, he gave me the same answer he'd been giving me for weeks. Fine, Grandpa, everything's good. But his eyes told me something different. There were shadows under them that no 8-year-old should have. He'd taken to leaving the light on in the hallway outside his room at night, which he'd never done before, and once, when I came home late from a short run and opened the back door louder than usual, I heard him gasp from down the hall, the sharp intake of breath of someone who's been frightened, not just startled. I asked Brenda about it one Sunday when she came over for coffee. She said she hadn't noticed anything unusual. She said Tyler was perfectly fine when she was with him, that maybe I was reading too much into things, that kids that age often went through quiet phases. She said it with such certainty, such warmth, that I believed her. She'd raised 2 kids of her own. She knew children. I told myself I was projecting, that my own grief and guilt over my daughter's situation was making me see problems that weren't there. I went back out on the road. The second sign came in April. Tyler had a nightmare so severe that he woke up screaming and couldn't be calmed for almost 40 minutes. I held him on the couch with all the lights on until 2 in the morning. When he finally settled, I asked him what he dreamed about. He said he couldn't remember, but the way he said it, without looking at me, pulling the blanket up tighter, told me he remembered perfectly. I didn't push. I should have pushed. What I did do, the following week, was call my buddy Ray, who'd done some security work after he retired from CN Rail. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. I told Ray I just wanted to feel better about the house while I was on the road. Maybe get a camera for the front door, something for the backyard. Ray talked me through a couple of simple setups. He mentioned one that had a small indoor unit you could angle from a bookshelf, nearly invisible, motion activated. I told myself I was being paranoid. I ordered it anyway. I set it up on a Wednesday evening, angled toward the hallway outside Tyler's bedroom. I told myself it was for peace of mind. I went out on a 4-day run to Kamloops. I called Tyler every night. He sounded fine. A little flat, but fine. Brenda had been there each evening. Everything apparently was good. I got home on a Sunday afternoon. Tyler was at the kitchen table again, doing his puzzle. Same quiet, same smile that didn't reach his eyes. I sat down beside him and we worked on it together for an hour, without speaking much, just the two of us, and the sound of the furnace kicking on and off. After dinner I put him to bed. We'd him 2 chapters of the book we'd been going through together, a story about a boy who discovers a wolf pup in the Yukon, and I turned out the light and went downstairs. I opened the app on my phone to check the footage. I want to be honest with you about what it felt like to press play. Part of me still expected nothing. Part of me hoped for nothing. I was a 63-year-old man sitting at his kitchen table at 9:30 at night, hoping the camera would show me an empty hallway and prove that I was just a tired, anxious grandfather who'd been on the road too long. The first 3 nights were an empty hallway. The 4th night, a Thursday, Brenda had been there until 8 o'clock. I watched her say goodnight to Tyler on the footage, watched her ruffle his hair, watched her walk down the hall toward the front door. I watched Tyler go into his room and close the door. Normal. Ordinary. Exactly what I'd told myself I would see. At 11:47 p.m., Tyler's bedroom door opened. He stepped into the hallway in his pajamas, moving slowly, the way children move when they've been told to do something they don't want to do. He stood there for a moment, not moving, and then Brenda came into the frame from the direction of the living room. She had not left. She had been in my house for almost 4 hours after I'd assumed she'd gone home. I watched her lean down close to Tyler's face and speak to him. The camera had no audio. Ray's budget setup didn't include sound, but I could see Tyler's body language as clearly as I've ever seen anything in my life. His shoulders came up around his ears. He shook his head. Brenda said something else, and then she took him by the arm, firmly, not gently, and walked him back into his bedroom and closed the door behind both of them. I stared at my phone for a long time after the footage ended. I need to tell you what went through my mind, because I think it matters. The first thing I felt was not anger. It was disbelief. This was Brenda. This was the woman who had sat beside me at Margaret's funeral and held my hand. This was the woman who had driven Tyler to his flu shot in November, because I'd been stuck on a snowbound highway near Jasper. My brain looked for every other explanation. Maybe he had a nightmare. Maybe she was comforting him. Maybe I was seeing something that wasn't there. I went back and watched the footage 4 more times. By the time I went to bed that night, I had no more other explanations. I did not confront Brenda the next morning. I know that might sound strange to some of you, but I had no audio. I had footage of her being in my house late, going into Tyler's room, but I didn't yet know what was happening inside that room. I needed to know the full truth before I acted, because if I confronted her and she denied it, if she had any chance to prepare a story, I might lose the only thing I had. I needed more. I called Ray the next morning and told him I needed the setup with audio. He drove over that afternoon and we upgraded the unit. He asked me if I was okay. I told him I didn't know yet. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, Whatever it is, you're doing the right thing. I've thought about those words a lot since then. The next time Brenda came over was the following Tuesday. I was home because I'd arranged to take a week off. I didn't tell her that. She arrived at 3:30, just as Tyler got off the school bus. I watched from upstairs as he came through the door and saw her in the kitchen. His face, Gerald, his face. I've driven in whiteout conditions on the Coquihalla. I've had a tire blow at highway speed outside of Hope. I've had moments where my heart dropped out of my chest. Nothing prepared me for watching my grandson's face fall the way it did when he saw Brenda standing in my kitchen. He recovered quickly. Kids are resilient in ways that break your heart. He said hi, dropped his backpack, went to the fridge. Normal. Surface level normal. But I had seen it, and I could not unsee it. That night, I stayed in my truck in the driveway, watching the app. I told Brenda I had an early morning call to my dispatcher, and had gone to bed. She didn't know I was 30 feet away. At 12:22 a.m., she went into Tyler's room. This time I had audio. I will not repeat to you what I heard. I don't think I could do it without my voice breaking, even now, a year and a half later. What I will tell you is that what I heard was not physical violence in the way I'd first feared. It was something that, in some ways, I think is harder to name and harder to prosecute and harder for a child to explain to an adult they're not sure will believe them. It was control. It was fear. It was an adult using the darkest parts of a child's trust and turning them into a weapon. She told him things about what would happen if he told me, about what had happened to children who told. She used his love for his mother, my daughter, still struggling up in Fort McMurray, as the thing she held over him. I was out of the truck and through the front door in under 30 seconds. I don't remember the exact words I said to Brenda when I turned on that hallway light. I remember the look on her face. I remember Tyler making a sound I will spend the rest of my life trying to forget. I told Brenda to get out of my house. I told her that if she touched the doorframe on her way out, I would call the RCMP from the front step before she reached her car. She tried to speak. I told her again, get out. She left. I sat on the floor of Tyler's room for the rest of the night, with my back against his bed and the light on and his hand in mine. He didn't say anything for a long time. I didn't ask him to. Around 3 a.m, he said, I thought you'd be mad at me, Grandpa. And I said, I could never be mad at you for this. Not ever. This was not yours to carry. The next morning, I called the RCMP non-emergency line. An officer came to the house. I handed over the audio recording and the camera footage. I gave them the full timeline. Tyler was interviewed by a child protection specialist, a kind, patient woman from the Child and Family Services office in Lejuki, over 2 sessions. He told her things he hadn't been able to tell me, and I am grateful every day for the people who do that work. What came out in those interviews, and later in the investigation, was that this had been going on for several months. Since at least November, which means it had started not long after the Zamboni cake. I also learned, during the investigation, that Brenda's adult son, her boy from her first marriage, a man I'd known for years and always thought of as decent, had known something was wrong. He hadn't known the full extent of it, but he had heard Tyler crying once when he'd stopped by unexpectedly and had chosen not to ask questions. He'd convinced himself it wasn't his business. He was not charged with anything. The law in Alberta is complicated about that, but I want you to hear it clearly. When you see a child in distress and you look away, you are part of what happens next. That is something I believe with everything I have. Brenda was charged under the Criminal Code of Canada. The process took 11 months. She had a lawyer. She had explanations. She had, of all things, the sympathy of a few people in our community who had known her and Margaret together for 20 years and found it hard to reconcile the woman they knew with what she had done. I understand that cognitive dissonance. I had felt it myself, standing in my driveway at midnight before I went inside. But I had a recording. I had footage. I had Tyler's testimony, consistent and detailed and devastating in its clarity. She pleaded guilty to avoid a full trial. She was sentenced to 14 months, with conditions on release that prohibited any contact with minors unsupervised. It was not enough. It will never feel like enough. But it was something. And something when you have spent 11 months inside a legal process with a traumatized grandchild and a job you've had to restructure around school hours feels like more than you expected. I retired from long haul the month after sentencing. I'd been planning to work another 2 years, had some financial targets I wanted to hit before I drew down my pension. But I sat down one evening with a cup of tea and looked at Tyler doing his homework at the kitchen table. He'd started doing his homework at the kitchen table again, which sounds like a small thing but wasn't, and I did the math a different way. The house was paid off, my CPP, and the pension from my years with the freight company would cover us. I was 63 years old, and my grandson needed me present, not available by phone from Kamloops. So I put in my notice. I'm not going to tell you the healing was quick or clean or that there was a single moment where Tyler suddenly became the boy he'd been before. That's not how it works. We started seeing a counselor in Edmonton, a woman who specialized in children and adolescent trauma. Tyler sees her every 2 weeks. I see her once a month, because she told me early on that my own processing of this would directly affect his. And she was right. There were months where he didn't want to sleep with the door closed. Months where loud sounds at night sent him rigid under the covers. Months where the word fine came back into heavy rotation, and I had to gently, patiently, persistently find ways to open the door a little wider. But here's what I also want to tell you, because I think it matters as much as anything else in this story. Last November, 14 months after that night in the hallway, Tyler played his first organized hockey game. Atom Division, orange jerseys, the whole thing. He scored 0 goals. He fell twice. He skated with his arms out to the side like a little human airplane and grinned at me through the plexiglass like I was the entire audience. And after the game, in the parking lot of the arena, in the cold, he grabbed my hand and said, "Same time next week, Grandpa. Same time next week." I have driven every major highway in Western Canada. I have seen the Rockies at sunrise from a cab that smelled like coffee and diesel. I've watched the northern lights from a truck stop outside of Whitehorse. I have had moments of real and genuine beauty in my life. That parking lot in November, with the rink light still on and my grandson's breath making small clouds in the cold air, was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. I'm telling you this story because I spent a lot of nights in the months after it happened, wondering what I had missed, what signs I had walked past, what questions I hadn't asked. I'm telling you because if there's a child in your life, yours, a grandchild, a neighbor's kid, a student, who has stopped sleeping normally, who flinches at sounds, who has quietly stopped being who they were, that change is a message. But child's behavior is the only language they have when they can't find the words. And the adults around them are the only translators. Tyler is 10 now. He still asks why geese fly in a V. I looked it up, finally. It's called drafting. The birds behind use the uplift from the wings ahead. They take turns at the front when the leader gets tired. They never let each other fall behind. I think about that a lot. If this story reached you and it helped you see something you needed to see, in your own home, in your own family, or in the life of a child you know, please share it. Leave a comment. Tell me your story if you have one. You are not alone in this, and neither are the children who are counting on us to pay attention. Same time next week. Always. I've had a long time now to sit with everything that happened. Long enough to stop replaying the footage on a loop at 2 a.m. Long enough to watch Tyler skate with his arms out like a little airplane and feel something close to peace. And in that time, I've come to believe something I want to leave you with. Not as a sermon, not as a lesson written on a chalkboard, but as something I learned the hard way in a hallway in Leduc, Alberta at 63 years old. What happened to Tyler did not happen because the world is random and cruel, though it can be both. It happened because a chain of small choices, mine included, allowed it to continue longer than it should have. I chose comfort over instinct when his teacher called. I chose the easier explanation when Brenda said everything was fine. I chose to believe that love and history with a person were the same thing as knowing them. None of those choices were made with bad intent, but every one of them had a consequence, and that consequence was carried by a child who had no say in any of it. That is the thing about cause and effect, that we tend to forget when it's inconvenient. It doesn't care about our intentions. It only tracks our actions. The moment I stopped accepting fine as an answer and started paying attention, really paying attention, the chain began to break. Not because I was brave, not because I was particularly wise, but because I finally chose to act on what I already knew rather than on what I wished were true. That is what I mean when I think about moral courage. Not the dramatic kind you see in films, the quiet kind. The kind that makes you install a camera when your gut says something is wrong, even though your heart hopes it isn't. The kind that keeps you sitting on a cold floor all night because a child needs to know someone is staying. The kind that walks into a lawyer's office and says, "I don't care how long this takes. I don't care what it costs." We are seeing this through, and Tyler, watching him find his way back, has taught me more about resilience than anything I encountered in 31 years on the road. He didn't bounce back. He worked his way back, slowly, unevenly, with setbacks and quiet nights and questions I couldn't always answer. That is what real resilience looks like. It is not the absence of damage. It is the decision, made over and over again in small moments, to keep going anyway. If you take one thing from this story, I hope it is this. The children in your life are always communicating. Not always with words, sometimes with silence. Sometimes with the way they stop running to the door. Sometimes with a smile that doesn't quite reach their eyes. Our job, as grandparents, as parents, as neighbors, as anyone who has a child in their orbit, is to be literate in that language. To notice, to ask again when the first answer is fine. To trust the feeling in your chest that says something is not right, even when every surface level sign says otherwise. The geese never let each other fall behind. I think about that every single week